Hey guys, it's Nick. I got a demo for you today that's about rendering with Maxwell. Maxwell is a rendering plugin. It's really versatile. It works with a lot of different programs like SketchUp, Studio Max, Maya, and Rhinoceros. And it's cross-platform, so it works with Macs and PCs, which is really useful. And it's a very powerful renderer, but it's also pretty simple to use, and that's why we like it. Rendering is extremely complicated task. It's something that if you're a professional, it can pretty much be your full-time job. You could spend days just working on a single image, getting it to work right, and that's not something that we want to be doing in school when we have a lot of other things to do. So it's useful to have a tool under your belt and a process for using it, so that you can get a really high quality image out fast, so that you can move on to other things. The other thing that's important to know about rendering is that a lot of times people think rendering is the last thing that you do on a project, when you're going to make the beautiful image that you can use to sell the project to a client or to your jury. And that's really incorrect. When you're rendering, it's a part of the design process as much as it is the final polish. Renderings can help you understand your design. They can help you test out materials. They can help you test out geometry, other kinds of moves. So you really want to be making some quick renderings, early on in your process, so that you're not kind of surprised by what you get when you start to apply light and materials and things to it. And that brings up a third really important point. A lot of people think that rendering is really about geometry. It's if you make a really nice model, and you throw it in the right renderer, that's going to be pretty much all you need. It's really false. Rendering is actually four things. It is definitely like geometry. Let's be clear. The way that you model something has a lot to do with the way that it looks in the computer. You want to make sure that when you're modeling, you are paying attention to some details in your design. For example, the way that these windowsills are, you could just make these as a big punch in the wall with a piece of glass in it, but the more kinds of edges and things that you have in it, and the more accurately you render that. This is actually a really nice casement window. Look at that. You can see that this window's in front, it's going to slide over. There's kind of relief joints in this model. You can see that the stairs are done really well. You can see that there's these kind of vents here. This is a fairly detailed model. You can see the relief here in the panes of glass. This is going to render nicely because those little details you can see here, just in kind of the crummy sort of Rhino render. The little details catch shadow, and they help you read the geometry of it. See here on the facade, these little white lines. These are the joints that are showing up in the model, giving us a fair bit of detail. This person modeled the parapet. Rendering is great as a learning tool because it kind of exposes the parts of the building that you don't understand. A lot of times you're making something and you're oh, well, is that an opening, or is that a certain kind of door, or how is that door framed? You can see that this kind of sliding glass door has sort of a clear story piece above it. You can see that they've thought about the distance between this overhang and this privacy wall, and all these details kind of come into the forefront when you're thinking about creating an image from it it's supposed to look fairly realistic. And a lot of these things can be faked or they can be glossed over, but again, I know that when I was in school, just thinking about modeling something for rendering, really made me pay attention to a lot of details of design that maybe I hadn't considered up to that point. And so that's really good. But so, it does matter what you model, but the modeling isn't everything. There's a lot of details, missing from this. And in fact, I could model this with actually less detail if I knew what I was doing, because of the other things. The other three things that matter are the camera. And so you can see here when we go to, just like we did last week, having the right view of the building, that looks realistic, that is well composed, is so key. Because if you don't have the right view to start with, your rendering is not going to be any good anyway. No amount of photoshopping is gonna really fix that for you. You also want to have a camera, and you want to have a good view saved, because you're going to be coming back to it frequently. And if you haven't saved your view, you're going to be in trouble basically, because any work that you've done in that view to set up the lights correctly or to set up the materials for a certain view is going to go to waste, because you can't get that view back the next time you open it up. So rule number one for rendering is to save a camera. Okay, you're working in that camera, and then don't mess up that camera. Okay, make sure you have a copy of that file. Just be really careful, like once you have it, that you're maintaining the integrity of that file. So cameras are key, and cameras are important because they're actually the way that Maxwell works as a renderer. If you look at Maxwell in the settings, we'll talk about this in a minute. The settings for Maxwell are in terms of cameras, in terms of f-stop and ISO and exposure. And if you've ever done any work with a physical camera, all these tools will be familiar to you, and all these different terms. And in fact, they will have a realistic effect on your rendering. And on the flip side, if you've never used a camera before, if you model a lot and you render a lot with Maxwell, you will learn a little bit more about photography and the way that images are captured architecturally. And so that can be really useful as well. The second piece we're going to get into that's important, well, actually, I guess it's the third. So we have the model, the camera, and the third thing is the materials, what things are made out of. If you're looking at what we've got in this model so far, you see we've got a pretty basic kind of palette of materials, or at least that's what it looks like. These little pieces that are kind of seafoam green or kind of turquoise, those are supposed to be glass. We have a layer called glass. We have the ground, and we have this model, which is actually just says basic. And a lot of times, if we're just sort of in like the design stages, we sort of vaguely know what things are, but we don't really know specifically, and that's maybe as far as we get, especially in like the earlier years. But the materials that you use in a model are really critical, because that's what's basically going to render. And once again, rendering kind of forces the issue. You can say, well, what kind of glass is that? Is it totally clear? Is it slightly transparent? Does it have like a fret pattern on it? What kind of concrete is it? Does it have a slight kind of color to it? Does it have a texture to it? What's your ground cover? Everything you're doing in the design comes into question, because you have to think about what it looks like in the rendering. And the rendering can allow you to make some really realistic looking materials pretty quickly, because there's a pretty good library available for tools like Maxwell. So, I personally learned a lot about materials when I started to render, and the way that materials interact with things, which brings me to my fourth point, which is light. I probably ended with the most important thing, and maybe I should have spoken about it sooner, but light is the most critical element in rendering. If your lights aren't set up correctly, you're basically not going to get a good image. Light is how your materials interact with each other, so like you'll have color that bounces off one material onto another. It's really, really critical to understand light and the way that it works. And Maxwell is what's called a physics-based renderer, so it uses something called photon mapping, which is that it kind of sprays light around, and then the light bounces off surfaces, and that creates illumination. And that's actually the way that light works in real life. It doesn't just fall on things directly from the sun, it bounces off surfaces. And in this case, we're only going to be worried about like an exterior setting today. I'll talk about interiors probably later in the course, but this is going to be plenty for today. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through a basic tutorial on how to apply lighting and materials, and how to get a simple render out using Maxwell. So again, I've got my camera that I'm going to use, and let's go ahead and get our Maxwell system set up. So what you want to do is, the first thing you want to do is go to Render, and then go to Current Render and change that to Maxwell. If you haven't done that, none of this is going to work. So once you've changed the render to Maxwell, you can go into the Maxwell menu, and we're going to open up a couple things. We're going to open up the Scene Manager, and this is where things get a little complicated in our scene in our system here. We're gonna lose some space pretty quickly. We got the scene manager, and we're gonna open up Maxwell Fire. And Fire is great. This is actually what makes Maxwell a really nice tool. Also, one of the things you have to know about rendering is that it can take a long time. And rendering is one of the things that will max out your computer. Like, you will hear the fans come on, your computer will hurt. That's because rendering takes 100% of your system's resources. It'll take as much RAM as it can. It'll use all of your multiple cores on your computer. It's probably the first time that most people ever really see their computer working as hard as it can. Towards that end, even when you're doing that, it can take a long time to render something, especially something complicated or something very, very large. So it's really a bad idea to put off rendering something until the last minute. I see too many people, like, the night before review, start a big rendering and it takes like 10, 12 hours, and then it doesn't really work for them, right? Like, they aren't able to get it out for review, or they aren't able to get it out in time to print. Rendering is iterative. You have to do it multiple times. So you've really got to plan ahead if you want a really nice image. But Maxwell has a couple of tools, though, that help negate that difficulty of the time involved, and one of them is Maxwell Fire. And I'm just going to go ahead and just start it up. So if I click on this button here, I get Maxwell Fire, and you can see this image right here is a representation of what my design would look like rendered. So it's kind of fuzzy, and what it is just a really rough approximation of what's going to happen if I did send it to the renderer. Of course, if I did, it would be a lot cleaner, it'd be a lot nicer looking. Let's go and look at this. So what's different about Maxwell and this particular kind of rendering process is the soft shadows. And if you look at the edge of where a plane meets the ground, you can see this kind of fuzzy kind of thing. That's the light being scattered. Now, there's basically just ambient light. There isn't any direct light on this model at all. You're not really seeing that. I'm just kind of buzzing around here. But you can see that, and then you can also see a few things. So that when we pull back, you can see how these areas are a lot darker, and the light kind of falls off from there. But you can still see the inside, these kind of punches, which are not yet glass. But you see how you get a lot of contrast, and you read the model, as separate from the ground because of those shadows. This is what a lot of renderers, until maybe 10, 15 years ago, didn't really do. A lot of them did really crisp shadows, and they looked really fake. But the way these start to look real is because they approximate the way that the sun behaves or the way that light behaves on an object really well. Another point I want to make, it's critical, is that you must have a ground for your models. And if you look at the model that I gave you, you've got a pretty fair ground plane. It doesn't go on forever. It's just a single plane, but it goes on far enough so that when I'm looking at my building, I can't see the edges fall off. I can't see the edge of the world. That's critical because it really, having a ground, first of all architecture takes place in the ground, has a relationship to the ground. But second of all, you need the light to bounce off of the ground to help illuminate the building. If you don't have that, your building's not gonna, it's not gonna look accurate, it's not gonna look right. The ground contributes a lot to the way that light paints a building. It's like a reflector, okay? And even more important than that, if you don't have a ground, the building floats. It doesn't look real, and it doesn't cast its own shadow, which is enormous for understanding the mass of the building and the volume of the building. Just out of curiosity or whatever. Yeah, you don't want this thing like a video game. It's kind of floating out there, okay? If I see that on a review, I'm going to freak out, okay? So, you've been warned. Put a ground down for your building. Okay, so that's the basic, just basically how this preview works. But let's go ahead and be a little bit more realistic. So, if you go under Scene Manager here, you got a bunch of tabs, and the one that we want to play with right now is the environment tab. It's like the 5th tab over. And there's a couple of different settings here. There's constant dome and physical sky, and we won't talk about image based yet. But the dome is this artificial kind of it's almost like a lighting setup that's in a studio. Okay, it's very even sort of light. And actually, if we go to the camera settings, is the camera setting. We can let me make this a little bigger for you. Play with these settings here, and these are you got the kind of presets. And you can just kind of set some things up. Let's see if that does anything. Okay. You can I'm just going to skip that. You can change the EV, which is the exposure value. You can see that if I set the EV a little bit lower, it's going to brighten up the image. So it's a little bit better. It's a little bit more like what we kind of expect, and you can actually start to see more of that soft shadow that the building's casting, here. Okay, but then if you go too far, you can pretty much wash it out. Okay, so somewhere between 11 and 13 is not too bad, and you can even type things in if you want to, if you need that. But that's just a way to graphically kind of set to see what the exposure is, and this is exactly what you do if you were looking at a piece of film. The f-stop is a setting you can play with, and this is 5.6. If you reduce it, you can sort of bring pieces of the image into or out of focus. It doesn't really show up like super well right now. Remember, this isn't really rendered. This is actually just us seeing a preview of the rendering. Okay. But you can look at those settings. I'll give you like a PDF that kind of explains what those are. But the main one you're really going to worry about right now is your exposure value. Okay, and then since you've got that set up, you can go back, and now this is just soft shadow. These are just indirect. This is like indirect light. What you're not getting is direct light that you would get from the sun or from a more direct light source. Like if you were setting up a model, like a photo of a model, you'd have your key light. Well, if you click on the checkbox to put sun on, now you've got the sun. And so now you've got the contributions of two systems here. You've got the hard shadows, or the stark kind of dark shadows of the sun, and the indirect light soft shadows, right, working together. But you can see I've washed out my image again, so now I got to go back to camera and probably bump up my scene again to something like 13. And I don't have any materials in this, so I am losing a lot of geometry, right? Let's go back to my camera. I'm not really doing a very good job of showing screen. So at this point, you probably noticed that we have sort of like this vignetting that's happening here. This kind of dark, spot around it that has a bright spot in the center. What that's caused by is the fact that we have a really low lens length, so that makes a really small kind of like aperture. You can fix that if you go into the scene manager. Actually, sorry, if you go into the camera settings, and if you increase that lens length, you can see that sort of happens. And this is because it's actually a physically based camera. And so the computer is actually simulating what happens with the way that light enters into the camera. You can see that the higher the lens length, the less the vignetting. But of course, you're gonna miss some pieces of your image. So you can still have the lens length that you want. But what's going to happen is that you just need to actually, if you don't like the vignetting effect, you would go in either in Photoshop or even in the Maxwell Render. There's actually a setting, and we maybe talk about that later, that will de-vignette the image. But right now, that's pretty much what's actually going to happen if you took a photo with these settings. You can see though with the light, the way we have it set up, with the constant dome and the sun, you get a lot of like nice contrast, from like this direct piece, and you get just these nice kind of a combination of dark and light shadows. The sun in this case is not really controlled by the user. It just basically represented, I think, from coming from the bottom, which is considered to be the south of the model. If you want to use the sun, you go in and change this to physical sky. And you can see what's happening here in the physical sky is that the light actually begins to take on a different color. It's because the color of the sun light changes depending upon the time of day. It's more accurate. You also have atmospheric light that is scattered by the sky, and it creates, in this case, kind of a blue tint to the shadows. You go back to constant dome. And of course, that's going to interact with your materials differently. But it does have its kind of a nice aesthetic. You can see it. So it's got like kind of orange in spots, but then also tinged with blue. You can see the kind of orange of the sunlight. But we're not really controlling that, so we want to take another look at that. I'm actually going to go back to my camera settings here. I'm going to save my camera because oops, that's not what I wanted. One more try. Let's go to my name. Let's click save. And that's going to overwrite my camera. Okay, so if I go into my physical sky, you can see like I've got various things like the temperature of the sun and different colors and stuff like that. You don't really need to worry about that right now. You just need to know like enough that you're using the physical sky. If you go into the next tab here, you can change the location of the time. We can change ourselves to let's see if Des Moines in here. I don't think Ames is probably in here. No offense, Ames. Nope, I don't think so. Let's look for Des Moines. Yep, there you go. Des Moines, okay. So now we're on the right latitude longitude. And this is assuming, that in your model, up is north. Okay? You'll need to orient your model properly in Rhinoceros in order for this system to work, or you can do the scene rotation here. So if you know what it is, I can say okay, 90%, and look at the difference. Like already, once I type in those numbers, right, it instantly updates. It's 120 degrees, which is just so nice. You can see though that I get a nice contrast between the two sides. So you can either rotate the model, or you can change the settings. I'm actually just going to go back to our original settings. You have the date here, which is also you can sort of scrub this. It's great. Look at that. So 4 o'clock, all the different days of the year. You can see that as it gets later in the year, you get this kind of twilight kind of effect, and then as the days get longer, you've got more and more sunlight. What you really want to be looking at for the time of day is earlier or later in the day. You really don't want it to be noon, because then the sun's overhead and then you don't really get enough contrast between objects. Downlit is not a great way to look at a building. When you photograph something in real life, you do tend to wait for kind of the magic hour, right? The sort of towards the end of the day, sometimes at dawn, because you get a nice even coverage of light, and then often you get light that illuminates one face of the building, but like not the other face of it. So you want to try to adjust things for enough drama, or so that you can really read the geometry well. So in this case, I'm actually looking at it, just in this particular time of year. I'm looking at it at 1 o'clock, but you can see that like I am able to read sort of the volume of the building. We've got a pretty good contrast between the two sides. And see here, it's kind of washed out when I'm looking at it at noon. You know, but here at like sunrise, I might get the two sides. Remember, you can also adjust the exposure values and things too. So spend a few minutes, experiment with this to try to see, like, okay, what kinds of light am I getting? You know, how is that helping me, you know, read the building or talk about the building? You know, it's not bad. This is really pulling out the geometry here. Creates a nice contrast between this and the inside, and a nice shadow. So some of this you can just eyeball. And I've got an image here that I think I kind of like. So I'm gonna talk really briefly about how to export that image as a final image. So if I've got an image I like, I go to rendering and export, and I can say render. And you don't really need to mess with this stuff too much. Just click on render scene. And this is going to fire up the Maxwell Render program. And you can see already what's happening here is it sort of starts off fuzzy. It's kind of like the way fire looks. And it gradually comes into focus a bit. Like it gets less and less grainy the longer I let this run. And this is Maxwell. Maxwell is kind of iterating the image over and over again and kind of like refining it. And the advantage of Maxwell is that if something goes wrong or you don't have enough time or the image is too complicated, you can take this image, even in its kind of fuzzy state, and it might be good enough for review, or at least you get feedback. You're not left with nothing. A lot of times with other renderers, you know, you're like rendering something and it'll sort of scan, you know, down the screen really slowly. And what ends up happening is that maybe you get half an image or maybe just a few lines of it, and then you got to go to review, and you don't have anything. Maxwell at least will always give you some kind of a fuzzy remnant that'll work. And the longer you let Maxwell run, the more refined the image gets. You can see here, there's this kind of sample. Gosh, I'm drawing a blank here, but it's basically like each one of these things is sort of like a sampling pass, the sample level. And it's just going to increasingly like sample the image, and it'll say like, okay, 33 seconds to next level, right? Update in 30 seconds. So now we've got 10 sampling levels. Like we've actually added 10 iterations, and at 10, it's pretty good. A little bit of noise, a little bit of fuzz in the kind of high contrast area, but you can see if you look at this really closely, you are starting to see some resolution in these objects. Like they're starting to really show up for us. You see some nice soft shadow, some light bounce off of this onto this object here. So this is looking pretty good, right? It's not bad. When you're ready to finish it, you can just say stop. Okay, and it'll stop. It'll say render finished successfully. What's really great about Maxwell too is that once you've got an image that's already been rendered, you can experiment with the different settings. You can see I'm playing with the ISO level here, it's exposure. You can see down here, this is what will happen if I play with that ISO. I can increase or decrease the contrast in it because that information is in the file. Okay, I can play with the shutter speed. Same thing. Lost my thing here. And then if I've got that change, I can say refresh, and then that'll actually update the image. So I've got a fair bit of control, you know, over the image. You can change the temperature of the light. So the hotter it is, the more blue. The cooler it is, the more red it gets. This is so you can use this so that if you took a photo at a certain time of day when the light was more red, you can add more blue to it. and then that's actually a way to make the image more white. Take the color out of it. You can play with the tint of the image, which is going to change the color kind of gamut. The bird, this is where you take out the vignetting. You take out the bird, but it also kind of takes some of the contrast out of the image. So that's something you can play with as well. There's so many different settings here, but anyway, so you have a lot of control over it even after it's been rendered. And then if you are done, you can just say save image, and you can just go to your desktop, and I would save it as a TIFF. A TIFF is a true image format, TIF, and it's a high resolution. It's lossless. You can always save it later on as a JPEG after you've edited it, but once you save it as a JPEG, you lose a lot of information in the image. You can always open up TIFFs in Photoshop and things, so I just go ahead and save it as a TIFF. I do 16-bit because that saves, actually you can go ahead and do 32-bit color, and that's going to save all the information in the file. And then if I have that image, I'm probably gonna. I don't think I have Photoshop here, but I can open it up, and there you go. So you've got your image. Okay. So not too bad. Okay, so that's just the basic kind of output. But I haven't done anything with materials yet. I haven't really looked at that. But that's the basic kind of premise of outputting geometry with lights. Let's go ahead and look at that in Maxwell with materials.